Hello and welcome to episode 4 in my commentary on the Russo-Ukraine war. This time we're going to talk about the very uncomfortable topic of war crimes being committed in that particular conflict. And as always, I try not to dehumanize anybody. I try not to engage in anything other than solid critique. This is, of course, a very difficult topic in that regard. People have seen all of the stories about Bucha, but there's a lot more to these stories than, of course, the media is willing to pick up on. So I'm going to start with a comparatively minor war crime that was being done by both sides early in the war. But that's changed, and I'll talk about that as we go through it. And this is shooting pictures of prisoners of war specifically for propaganda purposes. Now, in this category, there are certain things I'm not including. I'm not including the video documentation of soldiers surrendering at Azovstal in Mariupol, for example. I'm not including things that are purely documentary. Yes, we have these prisoners or things like that. But what I am including is videos of what prisoners purport to say about the other side, or purporting to show how great or compassionate one side is or the other. It's also worth noting in this particular context that none of these videos which have come out of Ukraine have in any way risen to the level of the sorts of abuse of prisoners that we saw at Abu Ghraib during the American occupation of Iraq. But just because they're not as bad doesn't necessarily mean they don't count as war crimes. Now, early on in the war, both sides were producing these sorts of videos. The American press, particularly critics of the current political establishment, were very, very critical of the videos which came out, particularly from the Ukrainian side, because those ones were widely circulated on social media. And to their credit, the Ukrainian military appears to have stopped this practice. As I say, none of the videos rose to the level of what we saw with Abu Ghraib. I'm not convinced that there has to be a criminal prosecution, and merely a view that, we don't want to be known for committing war crimes, so we're not going to do this anymore, in my view, is sufficient in this case. But, I'm not a military lawyer, and this is a separate thing. On the Russian side, on the other hand, these sorts of videos have continued to come out. People like myself who actually go out of our way to expose ourselves to as many sides to the conflict as possible, come across this unfortunate set of propaganda, even though it's not shared on Facebook or Twitter or other main social media platforms of the West. And because of this very strong, I guess I would say, separation of Russian and Western media, the fact that now both of them sit in their own, for lack of a better term, echo chambers, makes it very difficult for the same sorts of people who are criticizing Ukraine to be able to have criticism of Russia, because A, they don't see the videos, and B, Russia Russians are not going to see the articles. So this is an extremely important point as we come into some of the other discussions in terms of the role of media and the role of media in an international setting in holding accountable people for war crimes. This will become really important as we talk about Bucha. So this is a serious problem, and it's something that, in my view, Russia needs to stop doing. Full stop. So, on to Bucha. Bucha Massacre is given to the discovery of bodies after the Northern Front collapsed and the Russian army retreated. Initially, some 300, 400 bodies were found. The body count today stands at over 1,000. People usually found, men, women, children, mound, shot at close range. Now, the Ukrainian perspective on this is that these are serious, premeditated Russian war crimes which highlight inhumanity by Russian soldiers. The Russian perspective, mentioned by Secretary of State, the equivalent of Secretary of State, Lavrov on India Today, which, by the way, is a pretty good source if you want to see different perspectives on the war, was that these are all staged by Ukraine to make Russia look bad. Now, the first thing you have to understand is that nobody has an incentive to tell you the truth. Ukraine has every incentive to maximize the numbers. Russia has every incentive to say these are all killed by Ukraine. Yet in war, there are two things that are probably happening, one on each side. The first one being that Russia, during their occupation of Bucha and surrounding areas, almost certainly conducted anti-insurgency operations. And to what extent these were the result of this remains to be seen. We don't know. Similarly, Ukraine almost certainly is conducting anti-insurgency operations. How many of these bodies come from that remains to be seen. We won't know. Aside from legitimate anti-insurgency operations, you also have the strong likelihood that at least some of these deaths were the result of active war crimes. Of course, the two sides point fingers at each other, but we don't really know how many were the result of this, primarily because nobody's being transparent. Now, one of the problems that Russia has on this is that nobody believes the Russian perspective. Now, obviously, Belarus isn't saying anything. They're in reunification talks with Russia, as I understand it. India, this has been pretty controversial. I think the overall view in India is that Russia's lying. Of course, we've seen Germany release intelligence saying civilians are being killed. We hear soldiers talking about it, but at least the little bits that I've seen of this aren't particularly incriminating. The really incriminating pieces of evidence, in fact, come from an unlikely source, in fact, two unlikely sources. The first one is the Chinese media. And the Chinese media has said that Chinese military intelligence has evidence of ongoing, or not ongoing today, but continuous killing of civilians on that front for some period of time before the front collapsed. And China's been, perhaps has been remarkably neutral in this war, and in fact, so neutral that it has been seen as quite, the enemy by people who see the world in you're either with us or against us lens. So the fact that China says we don't believe Russia, we believe that there were ongoing war crimes during this period of time, is a very, very, very good reason not to trust Russia on it. Now, when I first came across this, my first thought was the Haditha Massacre in Iraq in 2005. Now, these aren't on the same scale in terms of numbers, but I think that they have a lot in common. I still do think that. In this particular case, a group of Marines were traveling near Haditha, and a roadside bomb exploded. One of them were killed, and several of the Marines went on a rampage in which they shot and killed men, women, children in a particular village. About 24 civilians were shot and killed, and the U.S. military looked at this, and a bunch of charges were initially filed. Several of the commanding officers were reprimanded and effectively removed from duty. Several of the Marines were charged. One actually went to trial. Nobody ended up with jail time. This really enraged a lot of Iraqis who felt like their countrymen had been summarily executed, which was a fair understanding of the facts. But I think another point to this is that the Jadito Massacre happened largely because the United States went into Iraq expecting that they'd be treated as liberators. And basically after the fall of Saddam, resistance movements started spreading and developing, and it became an extremely hostile and stressful place. I personally had a friend who served in Iraq and committed suicide a year after finishing her tour of duty. This was something that people weren't prepared for. When they came in, the Iraqis were extremely successful at ambushing American troops and exacting a pretty significant physical and mental health toll on the occupying force. And in my view, what happened with the Jadito Massacre very much was that under the stress of occupying in a very hostile environment, discipline broke down, people broke and flew into rages, and this is what happened. I think something similar probably happened in Bucha for a couple reasons. Number one, we haven't really seen any evidence of similar crimes committed in other fronts in this war. Bucha is in a sparsely populated part of Ukraine. It's close to the capital. While the area is historically majority Russian speaking, the proximity to the capital means that you have a lot of dynamics that can change very quickly, and having and the expectation of national defense, of course, is going to go up. Another thing is that we've seen these stories also coming out of the front talking about civilians trying to poison Russian troops. Now, the whole point of international humanitarian law is that you have a hard separation of combatants and non-combatants, and that blurs things quite a lot. So, if I were legalistically minded, I might argue that that this was a war crime on Ukraine's side, which justified what happened. I don't actually think that's the case, though, because if you go down that road, then anytime you have an occupying force in a war zone, you can justify just about anything because people will resist. So I don't think that argument holds much. But what I do think almost certainly happened is that we know that Russia came in expecting to be greeted as liberators. We know that Russia expected that they would only really face resistance from the Ukrainian armed forces. We know that they didn't even really expect that they would face that resistance. And as a result, they threw their own rulebook out the window. They sent people into places where they were ambushed. Many of them were killed. And my view is that under those circumstances, discipline broke down in a very bad way. It became impossible for people to maintain perspective about who were combatants, who wasn't, and this terrible event occurred. So there are two things I think that are really important to understand from this, though. Number one, if the Ukrainians sort of understand this possible dynamic and the fact that there was almost certainly a large degree of human error at work, then taking pride in the fact that they put the Russian troops under so much pressure that discipline broke down in this way is probably entirely appropriate. The second thing, though, is that Russia has persisted on this line of we didn't do it, we didn't do it, we didn't do it, they're framing us, they're framing us, they're framing us. Nobody believes this line. China doesn't believe it. And I think, although it's very likely that those who have been heavily involved in setting up this strategy of failure may have been removed from their posts, the fact that nothing ever referenced this event means Russia still does not take responsibility for it. They're still not committed to an actual, real investigation in terms of what happened. And there's very little evidence of any sort of serious reforms aimed at preventing it from happening again. In my view, the Bucha Massacre falls squarely on the shoulders of Russian high command. I believe that the foot soldiers were sent into a situation for which they were unprepared and ill-equipped. I think the pressures of this caused a breakdown in discipline, and this led Russian troops to kill the majority of those bodies that were found. Another point of evidence for this that I would actually bring up is the first war crimes trial of a soldier who was captured, a Russian soldier who was captured on the front by the Ukrainians. And the charge they charged him with was actually very interesting because it's a crime against the laws of war to deliberately target or kill civilians in an armed conflict of this sort. I mean, collateral damage is okay. That's why the United States is like, well, we bombed a wedding party and all these people were killed, and we killed a few people that we wanted to. We didn't really care about the others. They're just collateral damage. But deliberate killing of civilians is supposed to be off the table. At any rate, the soldier was accused of, I believe it was murdering an elderly couple in order to steal their car in order to facilitate his retreat. Now, the very interesting thing about that is that's a crime of desperation. That's not a premeditated inhumanity. And so, again, this comes back to the fact that Ukrainians should probably see a large amount of pride in terms of the fact that their level of resistance caused these sorts of breakdowns in discipline in the Russian troops. But that doesn't excuse the high command who threw their own rulebook out the window, who didn't believe that that they needed to prepare for the howl of war. And consequently, who sent people in to an environment that was almost destined to cause this sort of war crime in the way in which it happened. Now, many of the top generals have been removed from their post. Some are in jail. Many of the top intelligence folks are in jail on the Russian side. But as far as I know, none of them have been held accountable for this. And that needs to change. The fact that it hasn't happened again is nice. But Russia owes it to the world to investigate and to hold people accountable. Now, I've been going through, of course, reactions to this video and others, or not this video, but prior videos in the series, and I've come to the conclusion that most of my viewers don't really care what I have to say about the Ukraine war and efforts to move towards a just peace. So I'm going to wrap up this series fairly quickly with only one more episode, and that's going to be the geopolitics and the geopolitical interests of non-belligerents. So we'll talk about the US, we'll talk about Western Europe, in particular France, we'll talk about Eastern Europe, in particular Poland and Lithuania, since they are the most belligerent countries in Europe when it comes to relationship to Russia over this. We'll talk about India, China, and Southeast Asia, and we'll talk, of course, about the United States. I think I mentioned that. And we'll talk about the Middle East. And I think that that will help people understand why countries are reacting the ways they're reacting, because the West is like, everybody's united against Russia, but then you look out and you go, well, wait, everybody is the European Union, Canada, the United States, Australia, of which the United States, Canada, and Australia seem to be leading the charge, and everybody else is not quite sure what they're doing. Where does that leave Africa? Where does that leave Southeast Asia? Where does that leave India? And why aren't these countries coming along? Something that I think we do need to talk about. So I'll talk about that in the next episode, and then we'll be done with the series. At any rate, that's all I have for you today. Hope you have a great week. Talk to you later.